Hey guys, I'm the 50s Kid. This is a BMW X3. It's an E83 chassis and it needs new brakes. So we're just going to do a complete brake job, new rotors, new pads, all the way around. I'm going to show you how to do it and it's going to be fun. So let's get started. So first things first, when I do brakes or remove tires, on trucks with like really heavy tires, I try to jack them up just so they're barely off the ground. That way, it's just so much easier to get them on. You don't have to lift them up or anything. You can just kind of slide them sort of on the ground and lift them up ever so slightly. So that kind of helps. Number two, if your tires, don't just fall off like this, like you can see, they're just, I removed the lug nuts, but they're not falling off. What you might need to do is give it a couple donkey kicks. You just turn around, go backwards. Try to work the outsides. I do not remember this thing being so difficult to come off last time. Oh, there we go. Okay, sometimes donkey kicks are not enough. And the funny thing is, there is no rust in this situation. This is, California perfect outer space kind of corrosion right here, meaning like nothing. But sometimes you just have that situation. So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to clean up the insides right here. This is where it sticks on, sort of the center right here. I'm just going to kind of clean that up a little bit before I put the tire back on. Take a real close look at these rotors, guys. See this lip in here? That's basically where they were originally, and that's how much they've worn down. There's got to be, I don't know, is that 1 or 2 millimeters of wear right there? Basically, these are the original brake rotors on this car. And what they did every time they changed brakes was they did what's called a pad slap, which is where they just change the pads only and leave the rotors on and never change them. And yeah, that's not the best practice in the brake industry, I think. Or, I mean, it's a common practice, I should say, but it's not the best way to go. I'm sure whoever did this overcharged heavily for this job and just completely screwed this guy. So I say step number one is you want to get the screw that holds the rotor on off. You want to get that loose. And that's going to be a 6mm Allen socket. And what you need to do this is one of these. This is an impact driver, which means that when you hit it this way with a hammer, it's actually going to turn this way. All the force gets driven down into the screw, and then the socket has to turn to the left or the right. You can actually change which way this thing turns by pushing it in like that, turning it like that. I believe this one is a Tecton. Great thing, cheap as hell. Use some good sockets. We're just going to bang on it. Like that. That gets your screw loose. Now let's wiggle the socket around because that's probably stuck in there. Then we can use it to pull the screw all the way out. Step number two, we got to get this little spring out of here. You use a screwdriver for that, and we want to just pry it forward and see if we can pull it out. Sometimes you don't really need a screwdriver for it. Sometimes it goes easy. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's basically what was happening is the screwdriver was just hitting the back of the pad. So I pulled the screwdriver out so that I was able to pry fully this way, and then I could actually get it out. These are easy to reinstall by hand, but you need a little screwdriver to get them out. One thing you should do, put your key in the ignition and just turn to number 1 position. That way your steering wheel is unlocked and you can just turn the wheel by hand. And that way you just have more access, you can see it easier, much easier to work on it that way. Now, as you can see on this side, we have got a pad wear sensor, and I didn't buy new pad wear sensors because you don't need to unless the pad wear sensor actually contacts the rotor and starts to get worn down. That's when you get that brake light on your dash. It's like a little warning light. I'll try to pop it on the screen if I can find an example of it. But if that doesn't happen and you're replacing your brakes preemptively before they get that worn down, then you can reuse this as long as you can get it off without damaging it. Sometimes they're very brittle and you can't get them off. Sometimes you damage them with a pair of pliers, so I don't want to do that. I'm going to try to be as ginger as I can. There we go. So if you need to replace your sensor, you can see this one, it just kind of clips in down here. It's just rubber that is just pushed into a little bracket down here. So you just follow it back. Obviously it goes to this box right here, and that box just kind of flips open, and it's just that blue connector inside there. They just kind of pull apart. There's a little button on the bottom here. There's a little push tab. Push that, and you pull the sensor off, and you just kind of stick your new one in, and that's it. Real simple to do. Looks like I actually left the little spring in here, so I'm gonna grab that out. That actually goes around the sensor, goes around the middle of the sensor. Now we're going to talk about the most controversial topic in the brake job realm, and that is, should you crack the bleeder screw when you compress the piston into the caliper? And the thinking on this is that if you don't do that and you press the piston in, you're pushing whatever junk might be inside here, whatever corrosion or whatever, up through the brake lines and into the master cylinder. That could actually cause some damage to the rubber seal in the master cylinder, you know, around the piston, and that could degrade your master cylinder and you'd have to replace it. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought is, you know, you can't crack these bleeder screws free in a lot of areas because they're so rusted in there. And, you know, in some parts of the country, you go anywhere near a bleeder screw, it's just going to twist right off. It's going to crack right off. And then you're totally screwed. You have to replace the caliper at that point. So it's kind of like, you know, it just depends on your area and depends on you, really. I mean, it's a controversial topic, and half the guys out there do it one way, half the guys do it the other way, and everybody's done 100 brake jobs and they've never had a problem doing it their way, you know? So it's like, it just kind of depends on your area and stuff. I think it also depends on the age of the car. Obviously, you can see this bleeder screw, I mean, nothing's rusty on this car. This car's about 14 years old. There is corrosion though on the inside of here. I've cracked these bleeder screws loose before on cars this old, even here around California, and you know, there's corrosion in there. And what could happen when you go to tighten it back on is that corrosion could get in between where the bleeder screw seals to the caliper, and it actually might not seal perfectly, and you end up getting some air drawn into the system there, and you can never really bleed it all the way, and your brakes don't feel as strong as they used to. So for that reason, I choose not to crack bleeder screws. I push the stuff back up, you know, into the brake system, and of course, you know what I'm going to say, I've never had a problem doing it that way. So that's what I choose to do. But if you do want to go ahead and crack the bleeder screws when you do this, get yourself a wrench. On BMWs, it's a 9mm. You crack that free. You just put a piece of tubing over the bleeder nipple, and you just run that into a bucket. I actually have this for, you know, doing brakes or bleeding brakes. It's like a vacuum-based system. You hook an air line to it. It doesn't really work that great, but it does work as a normal catch bottle. You don't really need this though. You can just buy some tubing from the hardware store. Before you ask, I don't know what kind of tubing you're gonna need. I don't remember those sizes off the top of my head, but it's probably like, I don't know, it's probably like 3/16 or something like that. So get that tubing, run it into just an old, you know, water bottle, and you can just bleed it out as you're compressing the piston in. But like I said, I don't do it that way. I just compress the piston into the caliper and send all the brake fluid back up into the reservoir. Now, before you do that, you want to take a look and make sure that your reservoir isn't topped off, because it's not supposed to be. If you're doing brakes, that means your brakes are all the way worn down. This fluid level should have dropped as your brakes wore down. That was the old school method of, oh, do I need to replace my brakes or not? If you just took a look at your brake fluid and you saw that it was down at the minimum, you knew that your brakes were all the way worn down and it was time to do them. But of course, you know, people thought they saw like a fluid that was low and they thought they had to top it up. So that sort of system of measurement didn't last very long, and everybody just kept topping up their brake fluid thinking they needed to. And then what happens is you go and you compress your piston into the caliper, and if this thing is already full, it's going to overflow and send brake fluid all over and everywhere. And brake fluid eats paint, so it's actually going to eat the paint that's under here. You know, there's painted metal under here, and basically if you eat the paint off of that, you're eating off the protection. You're gonna just invite corrosion that way. So bottom line, if this thing is full, you're going to need to suck out some of the fluid. And the way you do that is you just get a turkey baster, you know, go to the dollar store, get a turkey baster, suck some of that fluid out, and put it with your oil when you go to recycle it next time. Now that we've got all that out of the way, there are multiple ways to push the piston back into the caliper. There are a couple of ways with everything still on right here, or you can take it off and then you can use a special tool that you buy to press the piston in. You can use a big channel locks. You can use there are lots of different ways to do it. One kind of quick and dirty method, especially if you're like replacing the caliper and or replacing the rotors and you kind of don't care, you can stick a screwdriver in and you can just sort of start prying. You have to make sure you get behind the caliper like that, or the rotor, I should say. And if you just pry outwards like this, what you're doing is you're pressing, you're pulling the caliper this way, which is pressing the piston in that way, because the piston is pushing up against the rotor on the back here. So when you do it that way, you're actually compressing it all the way in, and you really want to wrench on it. Make sure you get it all the way, because if you don't, then you might need to drive the piston. You might still need to drive the piston in even after you take the caliper off. So spend some extra time, make sure you're all the way in. That's a quick and dirty way to loosen things up. So next, we actually have to get the caliper pins out. And there are going to be these little plastic covers, which you can just pull off with your hand. So those are caliper slide pins. We need a 7mm in order to get them off. So stick this in and like that. You don't have to pull these all the way out, but I'm going to, because I'm going to end up cleaning them off and making sure they're all good and lubed up with the proper lube. Now, when we take this caliper off, we need to hang it up so that it doesn't actually hang from the brake hose. You don't want it to hang from the brake hose. That causes damage to the brake hose. So you want to hang it, you want to suspend it. Best way to do that is with one of these little hooks. I got this at my dollar store, but you can also buy them for 10 bucks if you can't find them. And you just kind of hang them, suspend them from the suspension. Now, before we get too far, I want to show you some alternative methods to the screwdriver method to compress the piston into the caliper. For a long time, I just used one of these, simple woodworking clamp, cheap, easy to get. You just kind of stick this in like that, and you can just tighten it up. This is basically a foolproof method, and it has the advantage of completely compressing the piston into the caliper. Basically, you can feel when you can't really turn that thing anymore, you know you're all the way pushed in, and then you can just loosen it off and do one of those. So that is another method that you can use. Now, another method that you could also use is you can just keep one brake pad in there, and you can, use the clamp on that. That's just in case you've already taken things off. Maybe you've already taken the caliper bracket off, and then you realize, oh man, I didn't push that piston in as far as I want to. Usually this happens when you've already got the new pads in there and you've already got everything cleaned and lubed up and you're ready to put it back on, and you can't get it on because the new rotor is really thick. The new pads are really thick, and you have to compress the piston in as much as you possibly can. So you usually have to kind of do that up in the air right here. And what you do is you take the new pads out, you stick the old pad on as just kind of a shim or something, and then you can press the caliper back in. In this case, I used the clamp, so everything is all good. And the reason that you need a brake pad in there as a shim is because the piston usually has a hole in it. You could also use big channel locks. A lot of people do that, and they'll just press on the edge of that, press on the edge here. If you just got those big honking ones, then you can compress them in that way. Problem is, the reason I don't like those is, they leave a little bit of a mark on the piston right there, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to dig into the metal at all if you can avoid it. So in that case, just use the old pad as well. you know, if you're going to do it that way, because it doesn't matter if you destroy the old pad, you're throwing it out. So things like that, you know, some pistons are phalonic, which is just like a hard plastic, so you could damage them as well. So you just want to make sure that you don't do that. It does look like that piston is sticking out ever so slightly, and be that the case, I'm pretty sure that it's all the way compressed in, but we could go ahead and set this up with the woodworking clamp, see if we can compress it in a little more, and I'll show how I would do something like that. I usually will hang it up, so that way we're just sort of like right up in the air. You can just do one of these, get on some metal part, give it a couple of turns, make sure that we can't compress it any further. Looks like we can't. We were already there. And like I said, there are little tools that you can buy. You know, there's just all it is like a straight piece of metal and a screw, and it just kind of grabs up against here and it just presses it in. There's a gun type of thing you can buy that just a couple of squeezes and it goes in. There's a ratcheting one that I have that's is only useful for quad pistons, that sort of thing. But yeah, usually all I really need is a screwdriver or a clamp. So we'll get our other pad out of there. And now we have to get the caliper off. There are 2 bolts on the back. Let me show you. So these are the 2 caliper bolts. They're 16s in this case. You might need a breaker bar or a really long ratchet if you have that, but I'm going to use this. And then in this case, my rotor is going to come all the way off, but I don't want to quite go there yet because I want to talk about something. So I actually put that screw back in there for now just to keep this thing on there. I didn't expect it to fall right off, honestly. I figured since this hadn't been removed in a really long time, it was kind of going to be pretty rusty, even though it is California. But I'm suspecting, just because I'm seeing some stuff here, I'm suspecting the last guy who did this, maybe these aren't the OEM rotors, and maybe the last guy who did this put some anti-seize behind there, which is a really great thing because it looked like the thing just fell right off there. But if that is not the case for you, what you're going to have to do is whack it with a hammer. And you know, you can whack right on the edge right there. If you're whacking on the edge, you're getting more of a rocking action. Just kind of what I was trying to do with the tire when I was trying to pull that thing off. And that's kind of what you want to do. If you're in a super rusty part of the country, you need an air hammer. You might need an air hammer. That can just speed up the process. And you just kind of go around the rim, go around the side, and just kind of, you want to rattle side to side, and that just kind of breaks the rust loose in the back right there. Another thing, you can also hit right here. Particularly if you need to reuse the rotors, you know, for whatever reason, if you're taking them off to do a wheel bearing or something like that, hitting right here, that can also give you more of a side to side kind of motion, but you can kind of hit on the side right there. That just kind of, that totally rocks the thing free, and you're not really hurting anything because it's the very outer rim right here, and the pads just touch sort of, you know, just somewhat in of that. In this case, it's not going to matter. I wonder what we're going to see behind here. I'm thinking there's anti-seize. Let's see what we get. It seems like somebody put some, yeah, they did. So they put some on the center right here, which is great. That's exactly where you want to put it. It's sort of not so great for me because I can't show you the worst case scenario, but this is a great example of, you know, why you should do it and why it helps. And that is particularly right here. This is the spot where you want to put the anti-seize, because this really is where the rust builds up, just this little ring right around here. So the guy who did this did it right. I think the guy who did the pads after him did it wrong, because he left those rotors on there when I think they should have been replaced, because man, there was quite a lip on there. So unfortunately, I can't show as much of the cleaning as I wanted to. I'm still going to show it, but in this case, whoever did this before actually took care of it pretty well. Because you can see there's no rust buildup right here at all. it's all been nice and cleaned off, and it's stayed that way. He probably put a little smear of anti-seize around here, gray anti-seize. It doesn't look like he did because, you know, I would expect to find residue like I'm finding in the center there, but it's not really, that's not, I suppose it depends on the part of the country, but this is not usually the problem area. And a lot of these actually have a little groove around here. Sometimes if they have that groove, rust can build up in that. That could be sort of a problem, but I believe the problem all of the time is going to be right here, right where the rotor meets this little lip right here. That's where all of your rust and corrosion build up. And that's most of the stuff that you end up cleaning off. So we're going to clean off the old anti-seize. We're definitely going to be putting new anti-seize on there so that the next guy has this exact same experience. So let me talk about some cleaning tools. If you are not doing a BMW and you're just doing almost any other car, instead of having lug bolts, you're going to have lug nuts, and there are going to be studs sticking out of the wheel bearing right here, or the wheel hub. And in that case, one of these could come in handy. See, it has a little hole in there. You just hook it up to your drill, and you just sort of use that to clean the surface around the bolts. And that kind of gets the rust. Usually you find a lot of rust just built up on here. So you can use that to get in there, and then you can go around in the centers there, and that kind of gets most of the rust. So that's typically what I will use. And then I will also try to use one of these cups along with one of these as well, something like that, to just kind of get in and, you know, at whatever angle I can to just get the rust off of in here, you know. Usually this kind of would get in the way, so I would use something like this on my drill and just kind of get in there and use that to clean the gunk off of that inside surface right there. I also have a brush like this for kind of getting in there. This one's super helpful. This one actually is very effective, so I would use that to just get in there. It doesn't have to be brush, it can be steel as well, but that's what I would do just to clean everything off. You want to get all the rust and gunk off of there. Make sure this surface is as clean as you can possibly make it. Next, we need to clean up the caliper. Cleaning is really the most important thing in a brake job. If you make everything clean and you just lubricate the right spots, and you use high quality pads and rotors, you shouldn't have any noise, you shouldn't have any problems, but you just want to make sure everything's nice and clean. So I'm going to use my drill and this little mini wire wheel to kind of clean things up. You can get a pack of these, all different sizes, at Harbor Freight for like $8. You want to make sure, and you want to make sure that you're real careful. You don't want to actually chew up the little rubber seal right here. So if you're kind of not confident in what you're doing, one thing you can do is you can not compress the piston in all the way, leave it sticking out a little bit, clean it off, and then press it in. And that'll just kind of make sure that you don't mess anything up. But I'm being pretty careful here. Kick up brake dust, don't breathe it in. Yeah, looks good. And now you want to clean the opposite end. You want to clean the inside surface where it's going to rest against the pads. So clean that off just the same. And on these particular calipers, there are these little contact areas right here. You can see where the metal is shiny. I like to get those areas as well. Make sure you wear safety glasses so you can get binged in the eye when one of these little wires comes off. I am always wearing safety glasses because eyeglasses are technically safety glasses. You only need to do the ones on this end. The ones on this end don't actually touch against the pads. Make sure we get the inside corners there. Man, this one's honestly probably faster. Now this caliper slide pin, it actually slides inside this bore right here. On the outside, you've got this little rubber sort of dust cover, and that's where the little cap fits on. They don't touch against that, but there's an inner sort of rubber thing that these do slide up against. And so that's why I am going to lubricate them, And I'm going to use a rubber safe lubricant. If you use a petroleum-based brake grease, it actually will cause the rubber to swell up, and that could cause the caliper to seize on this pin. I don't know exactly what grease they used before. It might have been just normal anti-seize. I think it was, because it's that gray stuff, but it's not good. It dries up, and that's not what you want to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean out the inside of that little rubber seal right there, and then I'm going to re-lubricate it using rubber safe lubricant. So I've got these little brushes that are made for cleaning engines. I'll try to throw a link in the description. I'm just going to pick the one that seems good. See, that one kind of goes through, and I think it's going to clean things. So I'm going to spray some solvent in there. I know, solvent's usually not a good thing when it comes to rubber, but it's okay. It's not going to cause it to swell because it just evaporates too quickly. So I'm going to use that to just sort of clean those bores out. Might go for a slightly larger one. Let's see. Yeah, that doesn't hurt. And then next, I want to clean off the actual caliper slide pins. So I'm going to just spray them, get some brake clean on a blue cloth, just clean those off as best I can. If your caliper slide pins are super rusty, you can always buy new ones from the BMW dealer. And the same thing goes for these rubber seals. If yours are all corroded or gone or something like that, you can always replace them. So now it's time to clean up the caliper. You want to use the same cleaning techniques. We're going to use the wire brush. We're going to get all the rust and corrosion of any or dirt of any kind off of these surfaces right here, especially the parts where you can see it's metal, where you can see it's shiny, not metal, but shiny. That's where the actual brake pads ride against. So you want to make sure that those are cleaned. Normally on brakes, modern brakes, you're going to see pad hardware, which are these little stainless steel kind of clips that go over these surfaces, and you want to basically pull those off. You always want to replace them. If you have brake hardware, always replace them, and the high quality brake pads are going to come with hardware, you know. When you pull those off, usually rust and corrosion actually builds up between the pad hardware and the caliper itself. So you want to take the brake hardware off, and you want to just clean underneath it. You want to make sure it's absolutely smooth, and then you want to put some brake grease on there to prevent rust in the future. Then you can put your new pad hardware on. In this particular case, I don't know why BMW didn't put pad hardware on these brakes, so we're just going to clean them up as is and reuse them. In that case, I use like a bigger cup for doing this because, you know, I need it to stick out longer. So that's, you know, one tool you could use. Let's see how this one does on it. Actually does pretty good. I'm gonna put it on the ground so I can get more leverage. Does pretty good cleaning it up. I think I'm gonna actually hit it with, I think they're actually, both sides actually look pretty good, but I'm gonna try to get that inner part and clean that off a little more if I can. Yeah, I mean, that's about as good as I can make it. So I cleaned the inside surface as well, as best I could. I mean, you want to do as good a job as you possibly can. You know, it doesn't take that long. That took me all of 30 seconds. So just that, you know, that little bit more effort pays off in the long run. So you want to spray the inside of your new rotor with some brake clean. We want to dissolve the oil that it comes with in order to protect it from rust. We want to clean all of that off. You can see there's a little bit on there. So we'll clean that surface off. You can wait until this is on to clean the outside surface, but usually the inside surface, you can't really clean it that well, and you can't even see what you're doing once it's on there. So I do this before I put it on. Okay, before I put the rotor on, I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize, like I said, around this surface right here. And I'm using copper anti-seize, that's what I have. Doesn't matter which one you use, they both have about the same properties. So I'll just do a little bead around the side here. Probably way too much, but I didn't really shake up the bottle. So now we can put our rotor on. I've got the screw all ready to go, ready to screw in. That thing doesn't need to be too tight. A little hand tight. It's not really gonna matter even if it does work itself loose. All that is just to help you when you're putting things back together, just so it doesn't get crazy. I'm gonna wipe off that excess there. So I could have, you know, put some across the whole surface of the wheel hub, but I don't really think it's honestly necessary here in California. It's just that little spot where I put it. That's the problem area. So now we're going to lubricate our caliper bracket with some brake grease. This is my brake grease of choice. It's the purple Permatex Ceramic Extreme. They have like an orange version that is like silicone based, and so that is rubber safe. You can use that on rubber seals and whatnot, but this one, as far as I know, is not that. So I use two different greases. You know, anything that's going to come in contact with rubber, like the caliper slide pins, I use silicone paste, which is also called dielectric grease. In this case, I use brake grease for these areas. So I just get a little on there. And basically you need to put this where those shiny areas were. And you saw where they were before. Hopefully you made a mental note of where those were before. One thing you got to watch out for is if you get a little over the edge on the inside here, it's actually going to come off onto the rotor, and that's going to get into your pad friction material, and that's going to be bad. So you don't need to go right up to the edge with this. You can just come back from the edge about 1 millimeter. I typically change my gloves at this point because I'm about to do something like this. And now we can grab the dirty brake caliper bracket and bolt it back in. Everybody plug your ears. Now, we are going to apply some lube to the piston surface as well as the inner surface that we cleaned. Man, this thing always gets loaded up. So, inner surface. So, you know, where does the brake noise come from? I don't think anybody really knows for sure if, you know, putting grease on the back of the pad is what prevents it, or if putting grease on the part where it slides is what prevents it. Some people don't put any grease on at all. In fact, you know, it comes from the factory with no grease. I don't know if anybody even realizes that, but there's never any grease when you do this, when you do your first brake job on a brand new car. They just don't use it. It's totally an aftermarket thing. It's part of brake job lore at this point. You have to do it, you know, it's kind of that one of those things. Remember to put some on the little tips where it was shiny as well, because that's a pad contact area. You know, it's just, there are people out there, it's another super controversial topic, I think. There are people out there who don't put any grease on at all, and they're fine. There are people out there who only put grease on the backs of the pads. They apply grease directly to the back of the pad, the whole entire back of the pad. Honestly, I don't know why, because you're wasting a lot of grease there. You only need it on the part that contacts the actual, you know, the part that contacts the caliper, which is why I put it on the caliper. So it's right there. I'm gonna get that little booger off. Yeah, I mean, I don't see the need to smear grease on this open area right here because it just attracts dirt. There's no point, it's a waste of grease. So now we can put this back on. She slips right on. So this is silicone paste, aka dielectric tune-up grease. It's all the same thing. It's I think it's called polydimethylsiloxane. I don't know why I've memorized that, but I have. So I use this where the metal meets the rubber. Like I said, rubber swells when you use a petroleum-based lubricant, so I just use this. So I'm going to put it on the very tip there. I probably could have applied it to the inside. That might have been a little better, just to the inside, that part where we cleaned out, but this is honestly going to work just fine. You just work it in and out a little bit, and you're good to go. Yeah, and like I said, if you're using the orange stuff from Permatex, which is quite a bit more expensive, they clearly state on the website that, you know, it's silicone based and it's safe to use on caliper slide pins. And that's why they mention that, because it's silicone based. It's basically this. It's dielectric grease with, you know, additional components. Who knows what. But, you know, I use two different ones. There are many people out there who just use the purple stuff on caliper slide pins. That's fine. It works for them. I have silicone paste, so I use it. Like I said, there's lots of ways to do this. There's no one right or wrong way. This is just my method that I've gleaned from learning lots of stuff. Now we can put these caps back on, protect this from dirt and grime. And now we want to put our sensor back in. So this sensor, hopefully you can see, there's a little nub on the tip of it. That's what contacts the rotor when the pad gets all the way worn down. And once that starts to contact metal, that's what sends the signal to the computer, and that's when you get your little warning. So when that happens and you start to actually, you get metal to metal contact, this thing wears away. That's why you have to replace it. But like I was saying, if that hasn't happened, you can just reinstall it right into the pad. And again, make sure that little nub is facing towards the rotor. Otherwise, it ain't gonna work properly. Don't forget to get your little hook back. Don't forget the little spring clip. That's important. So that is quite simply almost everything you need to know about doing brakes. We're going to do the rears now, and I'm not going to go into as much detail. I'm just going to show you some places where things might be a little different for you. But yeah, that's basically everything. Now you could choose to put a little layer of the anti-seize around this surface right here so that the wheel doesn't get as kind of stuck on. I don't really think it's necessary in my area. It just that kind of doesn't really, it's not really much of an issue. There's something else going on with these particular wheels. I'm going to clean up the inside surface of them and see what's going on there. So one thing I should have mentioned in the middle of the brake job is you want to take a look at your old pads. You want to see if there's any unusual wear pattern. If you have sort of a wear pattern at an angle, that is usually an indication that one of the caliper pistons or the caliper slide pins is sticking in its bore. That's why you want to clean them out and lubricate them properly. In other cases, you might have a situation where one pad wears down more than the other one does. That is more of an indication of a caliper piston that's sort of corroded and is kind of sticking in its bore a little bit. In those cases, you know, and especially you also want to take note if it's particularly difficult to compress the piston into the caliper. That is also an indication of problems with the piston. So in those cases, you may have to replace your calipers. If you're in just a really rusty, corroded area, that might be an issue. So you might want to go ahead and replace your calipers if you are running into issues with that. So I've used that the little wire wheel, and I've cleaned out the inside surface here. I think I'll probably put just a little bit of anti-seize around there just to make sure, and I'm getting way more on than I wanted to, which is typical. But I just wanted it on that inside surface there. That way we won't have any trouble getting these off in the future. I typically don't do this though. I don't know what it is with these wheels, but they're just extra tight than normal wheels are. Yeah, I just need to use these. I've always had to use these bolts to sort of pull this wheel on. They're super tight. I don't know what it is. I've never really found wheels that are this tight like this, but it's kind of how it is. So the rears here should be pretty similar to the fronts. We got to get this out. That actually happened. Those screwdrivers are not indestructible. So that was honestly kind of disappointing. And I suppose that's a good case for buying those expensive $30 snap-on screwdrivers. Although I think those $30 screwdrivers are a bit too much for my taste. A bit too rich for my taste, I should say. We'll just get these caps off. Hold on, I don't want to get trapped in there. In fact, I might already be. So, probably want to start with the bottom on this one and then finish off with the top, just because the caliper will be loose by then. And it'll come off at an angle. And you can actually get this off. There. Get those both out. Just have to hang this one up kind of like that. No room for power tools on this one. This is why I have a long ratchet like this, for leverage. Those out. We'll hang this guy back up. Man, the screwdrivers are failing me. That kind of sucks. Here, can we turn this up a little higher? I just need room to fit in here. Oh, so that one's a little bit seized. Even though they put the anti-seize in there. So we'll just get this cleaned up. This one is much worse than the front was. So maybe they only did the front brakes, or I don't know. And that's when our wire wheel comes in. Looks like this one was like already pitted and corroded in its life, but we got it nice and shiny, and we'll protect it and all that stuff. So let's talk about the parking brakes. These have parking brake shoes on the inside. It's what's known as a drum in hat type of rotor. So there's a little brake drum on the inside of this brake rotor. So it's just like an old style brake shoe type of situation. And you would just adjust them using this adjuster right here. You just kind of move it one way to push them out, move them the other way to push them in. I'll put the rotor on, I'll put the parking brake on, and I'll just check and see if it's holding that on securely. I'll get this piston cleaned off and the caliper. So I'm gonna clean up the caliper bracket just the same as I did on the front. Voila! Yeah, these areas where the pads contact just get little divots worn into them, you know, because there's no brake hardware there. I guess BMW's thinking is, why let them replace $2 pad hardware when we can sell them a whole new caliper bracket? There's some anti-seize on the critical area here. I'm sure to wipe off the excess. Actually, let's change gloves, right? Okay, I've already wiped off the inner surface. Let's get our screw ready to go. Now let's clean this surface off. Okay, let's get too much lube on our caliper here, which is typically what happens. Okay, let's see if we can have good aim here. Get this where it needs to be. Now in this particular case, this caliper is just in the wrong place, so I'm going to commit the cardinal sin, let it hang just for a moment, if I really need to. But don't worry, the rear ones are not that heavy. Typically it's like heavy truck calipers that give you that problem. Sort of light car ones aren't usually that bad. Click. Click. Torque to factory spec, as they say. You don't really need a torque wrench in this application. I mean, you know, when you're doing this for the first time, you want to make sure that you get the torque proper and all that stuff. So you usually use a torque wrench, but then once you've been doing this for a little while, it's like, you don't really need to. You can just tell, you know, you get the thing tight when you can't really move the bolts anymore. You're good. Like that's as critical as it needs to be. It's not a flywheel. When you get that thing super tight with a long ratchet and you can't move that bolt anymore, that's it. You've reached the proper torque. Trust me. If you're interested in torque specs, Google is your best friend. It's a way better friend than I can ever be on that, because all I'm doing is searching Google, looking in the Bentley manual, which I honestly haven't cracked open in many years, because you don't really need to. In this case, I'm going to put this pad here. Sort of slip this over the front, or am I? I might change my mind on that. Okay. There we go. Oh, you know what we didn't do? We forgot to clean out the caliper pin bores. Yes, we did. So I'm going to face these down so that I don't wash off the brake lube that I put on already. Silly me. If you accidentally get a little bit of lube on the inside of one of your pads, brake clean. Brake clean will rinse it off. It happened when I pulled this out, I hit the front. Okay. Now we are good to go. Let's clean off our caliper slide pins here. Sometimes your caliper slide pins can be a little cruddy and they won't clean up. So you can use this for that. Okay, got that silicone paste on there. Nice and smooth. Okay. I think we'll have to go handheld here. This bottom one in. Man, stupid strut's in the way, or shock I should say. Okay, put our little caps on, and don't forget the little clip. Looks like we got some excess grease in there. We don't need that in there. Just a little excess. And of course, the wheels on the other side. Actually, it's kind of touching the ground a little bit there. That's why it's a little hard to move, but yeah, you can feel that it's completely free. So that is it. That's rear brakes, basically identical to the fronts. Parking brake adjustment is going to be different. You can go ahead, if you align things right, you can get your screwdriver in and you can click that little clicker and that little adjuster and adjust things. I don't think it's going to be necessary, but I'm going to check it out just in case. So I'm going to go put the parking brake on, see if we can move this thing. And I'm probably going to need my screwdriver. Actually, what I'm going to do is remove the wheel from the other side so that that's not an issue. So, parking brake's on. It's honestly best to put the wheel on when you test this, but well, honestly, it might need some adjustment because we shouldn't even have this much play. I think it's only because the other side is holding us in place. So I will go ahead and adjust this until I get it to sort of not have that play. You gotta use a little you gotta use a little flashlight to kind of shine in there and see when you got it. See if I'm even going the right way. Who knows? Probably not. So I spent some time getting them adjusted, and you can see we don't really have that play anymore. So, well, that's it, guys. That is everything, hopefully, about changing brakes. I hope you learned a lot. If you thought I did something wrong, I'm sure you've already let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. I'm the 50s Kid. Thanks a lot for watching.